we were trying to do everything and anything, and everybody wanted you. And I just would like to open up by saying that, Adrienne, you could share with us a little bit, as you said, let me look around at this beautiful edifice that we're in, and just to share that you have been in closed doors in a room for how many days did you say?
5 days.
For 5 days. Hashem, for all the time that you've been inwards, that you should be able to take all the koach and all the energy and be able to give it out like you've never given it out before. And without further ado, Adrienne Gold, thank you so much for being here with us. We love you and we thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I'm so very, very sorry. I truly am. I know that there's really nothing like being near one another. And even with a mask and 10 feet apart, I honestly don't wish this virus on any of you. I'm not sure if you're aware, but I was with a group of 300. And once they got back, everybody tested negative when they left Israel, but they got home and within 3 days, over 100 of them were positive. There's a lot of it around. So just be careful with each other. And I managed to go 2.5 years without having any symptoms. And this was not fun. So better safe than sorry. So I think that this evening I was going to talk to you about forgiveness. You'll forgive my voice, it's a bit funky. But I want to begin with a true and very famous and what I think is fascinating story about the importance, especially as we move and we hurtle towards Shavuot, about the deep import of recognizing how interconnected we are and why forgiveness plays such a huge role in that. This is a true story. There was a man in the southern United States who year after year after year won the blue ribbon, which is something you get at a county fair for the best seed corn in the entire country. And he was renowned. And what was interesting was that year after year, he would give his seed corn to the neighboring fields, the farmers who were near him. And one day a reporter from a local newspaper heard about this and went to him and said, you have to help me understand. You've been a champion 5 years in a row, but you keep giving away your corn, you give away your seed. It doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? And the man said to the reporter, well, clearly you're not a farmer and you don't understand. But when you grow corn, the actual kernels, they dissipate in the wind and they move through the wind and they germinate in the fields around us. Now, if my neighbors are growing inferior corn, then my corn ultimately will be inferior corn as well. And so it makes sense for me to share what I have with them because the manifestation of their fields will impact mine. And this is an agricultural, and I give you an agricultural example because we know that Shavuot is not just a holiday that we celebrate as the giving of the Torah, which of course we do, but also is an agricultural milestone. And so many of our holidays are based in our agrarian agricultural history. And as such, it's interesting to see that Hashem makes the world not just philosophically and emotionally and spiritually, but also agriculturally in such a way that when we don't internalize and understand how intricately connected we are one to the other, that when we allow our neighbors to grow bad corn, then we ultimately have ours impacted as well. And so this story really struck me. And a second story struck me. I learned this just about a week ago, and I haven't been able to get it out of my mind. To me, it has a deep relationship with the principle of emunah, which I think is vitally important when it comes to the art of forgiveness, because forgiveness is, if nothing else, indeed an art. It is a state. It's not a happening. And it's the true story also of another African. I see that someone has a hand. No, sorry. It's an African animal called an impala. Now, I'd never heard of an impala. I don't remember the impala from Jungle Book. but I can tell you my father drove an Impala in the 70s. So apparently an Impala is an animal that is capable of jumping 35 feet in one single leap. But in Africa, it is kept in their zoo-like encampments behind a stone fence that is only 3 feet high. So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that this animal that can jump 35 feet in one leap is contained by a 3-foot high fence? And the answer, and this is agricultural as well, is that the impala is only able to leap when it sees where its feet will land. Because at eye level, it can't see above the 3-foot mark, it will not escape or jump or free itself because it cannot visually see where its feet will land. This makes me think of emunah, because we all know that the word for truth, emet, aleph, mem, taf, has as a kind of paradigm the idea, the aleph, we know where we began in a situation. We know where the situation started. And the mem, the middle letter of the alphabet, we know where we are right in this moment. And the taf, we know where it all ends. We have clarity from beginning to end. But emunah, we have the aleph, we know where we started, we have the mem, we know where we are in this moment. And all we get is one letter more, the nun. In order to get to emet, to truth, to clarity, you must have emunah. You must be willing to leap even when you can't see where you will land. This is often the case when it comes to forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is not identical to clarity. And this is the first jagged little pill you have to swallow. Clarity is when you see clearly what happened, why the insult occurred, why the damage to your ego was sent to you. You have an understanding, oh, I see. She had just had her eyes dilated for an eye appointment and she didn't put on her glasses. She didn't see me, that's why she didn't ignore me. Or yes, that person just got a terrible, terrible diagnosis and they were in a foul mood. And so their lack of warmth didn't have anything to do with me. Now that I understand, now that I have clarity, then I can forgive whatever slight it was. But it's important to know that forgiveness is not an example of clarity. Forgiveness is for when something is not forgivable. Because clarity is only a further understanding that restores your ego to a place where you can afford to say, okay, now I understand. My dignity has been restored. I am able to hold my head up around you. I can afford to open up that bank of goodness within inside of me. But forgiveness, on the other hand, is not for that. A true story, there was a school principal just outside of Toronto, where I live, who started to behave inappropriately with parents and with students. It was like he had no frontal lobe, no impulse control. He was vulgar, made off-colored comments, inappropriate touches. And they literally, when I say they rode him out of town on a rail, they did. They put him and his family on a train and they got him out so fast. It was horrendous. And of course, everyone was abuzz about it and talking about it. And 6 months later, they discovered that this man had a tumor on the frontal lobe where your impulse and executive function holds back the inappropriate. And of course, they were totally able to forgive him then. There was no problem with that. It was too late. He'd already passed. But we know as Jewish women, we are taught to judge favorably. We know we meet people in chapter 3. We know that we don't know the Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. We don't know any of it. We know only the Mem, where we are right now. And we're meant to judge favorably. However, forgiveness, being a state, does not mean all or nothing. And it does not always mean full restoration of a relationship. There's a Hasidic idea which speaks to me so much. And that is the idea that forgiveness has 3 levels. The first level of forgiveness, you may still be infuriated, hurt, wounded, angry, have no desire to be in the same room as that human being, in the same wedding hall as that human being. But you can bring yourself to not wish them harm. Now, most people say to me, oh, I would never wish anybody harm. But we do. We do. We do in the most subtle and in the not so subtle ways. When I think of, I don't know if any of you remember the movie Fiddler on the Roof. It was a very popular musical. And there's a scene where the Hasidim go to the Rebbe in the town, and they say to him, Rebbe, there's a bracha for everything under the sun, for what we eat, for everything we do, for everything we see. But tell me, Rebbe, is there a bracha for the evil czar? And the Rebbe nods and he says, of course there is. May God bless and keep the czar far away from us. And that is essentially level 1. Level 1 is that you are not able to be near that person, to see that person, to spend time with that person, but you can wish them well. You can hope for the best for them. You can do like Bruria and daven that they have clarity and wish them well. And with some situations, that might be the only level of forgiveness you can get to. But according to the Talmud, if you cannot get to that level, you are considered as though you are cruel. That's level 1. Level 2. The heat of the anger is still there to a great extent. You can still feel the churning, but you don't feel the need to sort of hide behind a door when you see the person. You might be able to say good Shavous. You might be able to, to nod and say hello. You might even be able to sit at a table with them. You're not beside them. You're not chatting with them. But level 2 is, while the relationship has not restored itself to its former state, you are able to be in a space with them and be at least polite and dignified. And that's considered level 2. Level 3 of forgiveness is the restoration of the relationship, not just to its former status, but to a great extent, even closer than you were before. Why? There is an idea in physics that if you have a rope, a thick rope, a relationship in many ways is like a rope. If you sever that rope in the middle, you cut that rope will never look exactly like it did before. But if you tie those 2 ends where you cut them, 2 things happen. Number 1, the ends are now closer. And number 2, the rope is exponentially stronger than it was before you cut it. This is one of the reasons that when you have good pearls, each pearl has a knot between it. Because if that necklace breaks, you're only losing what's right on the end. All relationships suffer damages. Broken trust, breaches of confidence, words that were unfair and caused you pain. But the reality is, if you can bring yourself to a place where you are willing to retie that knot, by the end of that relationship, whether it be with a spouse, your children, your parents, a friend, what you will have at the end of a long and successful relationship is knots all through, pearl knot, all the way through. And that those retyings make the relationship exponentially stronger. Now, there is an idea of 3 levels of willingness to forgive. I find these levels particularly telling because the first level we understand, we kind of understand it intuitively. The first level of willingness to forgive, according to our sources, is that there are certain people who will forgive anyone who asks them for forgiveness. Anytime you ask, I will grant it. The second and higher level than that is that there are people who will go out of their way to set it up so the person who needs to give repentance is in a mode where it's easy to do. The best way for me to describe this would be what I used to do with my children. One of my children had a very hard time apologizing, even when he so terribly needed to for his own development and growth. I just couldn't get him to say, I'm sorry. So I used to have to coax it out of him. Sometimes when there was a stalemate for too long, and when he owed me that apology, and when things were tense, I would do things like bring him home something that he really wanted or make him a dinner that he always loved. And he would sit down and he would say, oh, thanks, Mom. Thanks so much for the shirt. And thanks for this dinner. And oh yeah, by the way, I'm sorry about the other night. Literally set him up so that it didn't feel so difficult for him. This behavior, we do it with our children. We can do it with others. You make it easier for the person to get there. Of course, the next level of forgiveness is what we say every night before we say the nighttime Shema. People of that level don't just say, I hereby forgive anyone who hurt me or caused me pain in this transmigration or another. I forgive every Jew, whether they sinned against me intentionally, unintentionally, inadvertently, through money, through deed, through thought, through behavior. Let no person be punished because of me. And we know that at Yom Kippur, when we say Tefillah Tzaka, that we are asking for Mida Keneged Mida. We're asking for us to find it within ourselves, to judge favorably, to forgive and to let go, so that we too can be judged the same. Now, this is not always without contradiction. We know, our sources tell us, that when you are kind to the cruel, you will come to be cruel to the kind. We know that according to halacha, we are not required to forgive any human being who doesn't objectively do tshuva, put a plan in place, and ask us to forgive them. And yet, we still go on to recognize that it is praiseworthy and holy of us to be able to do so. So many of you may know this story. This happened during the Holocaust. Apparently, there was a Nazi who was raised as a Christian, and he was dying in hospital in Warsaw. And he had done some horrible, foul things, evil things. And he knew he was about to meet his maker. And he was terrified to meet God with this stain on him, and he needed forgiveness. So he told another Nazi guard to go into the ghetto or to go into the hospital and find one of the slaves, because the Jewish boys were slaves in the hospitals in the ghettos, and bring him so he could offer absolution. And so that's what happened. And they brought a young man who had been a slave there. And the young man came in, all but 11 or 12. And the guard confessed what he had done. He said, in the ghetto, he set a building on fire, and in the top window stood a husband and wife and a baby. The man put his hand over his wife and baby's face and pushed them, and they jumped. And as they were falling to their death, so I used my machine gun and used them as target practice. I ask forgiveness before I die. And the young man said nothing. He stood silently. He refused to offer him absolution. He didn't say, I accept your apologies. He didn't say, no, absolutely not. He said nothing. He lingered until the man died. After the war, this young man became a very famous writer. And he wrote a book called The Sunflower. And in The Sunflower, he discusses this dilemma, this forgiveness dilemma. And he held a symposium with world religions from around the world, posing the question of what had happened to him, and what they should have done. And without question, all of the Christians said he should have given him forgiveness. The majority of the Jews said absolutely not. And it was evenly divided amongst the others. But the real answer for that young Simon Wiesenthal was not whether or not he should forgive him. The answer was, could he forgive him? And we know that Yom Kippur comes and we can gain forgiveness from the Ribbon Shalom for sins between ourselves and he. But that God recuses himself, as it were, and cannot grant forgiveness for that is between human to human. That is purely within our domain. So the answer to the sunflower dilemma, which is still in print, in fact, I noticed it just the other day when I was in Yad Vashem, still in print, is that God cannot, that young man could not forgive that man, not on behalf of the people who he had killed. Only they could offer forgiveness. So let's go back to the corn in the fields for a minute. The problem with refusing forgiveness is that we end up with what we have as a culture today. It is no secret that cancel culture, as we know it, as Americans, as North Americans, has become the antithesis of Jewish philosophy. Judaism, at its core, is built on tshuva. The world is built with tshuva. Gan Eden and our very existence is the result of the acceptance of tshuva. But we live in a time where a person is canceled without judge or jury in the court of public opinion. We live in a time where the algorithms of our social medias feed us back only that which we already believe, that we already stand for. And yet we know that the highest level of adherence to understanding and yearning for Emet was in the situation of Hillel and Shammai. And we know that while they were arguing L'Shem Shamayim for the sake of truth, we know that our sages tell us that the reason that we majority opinions would always side with Hillel was because Hillel was able to clearly and articulately give back to the other their point of view in their words with their clarity of understanding, and that he would never state his position until he was first able to clearly articulate the one he didn't agree with. And we no longer can do that. We live in a polarized, bipolar behaviored society. And unfortunately, this lack of forgiveness for the other is reinforced around us because we are not able to sit any longer without clarity. And clarity is usually a delusion, an illusion and a delusion, because we can only see this side of the tapestry. Even if it is only for the sake of our own forgiveness, we must try and move the needle on our damaged relationships, at least to level 1. You know, the Talmud obviously explains that if a person has really terribly hurt us, someone has we just still have to find the strength to accept it on that first level. And if they don't apologize, we can still say our nighttime Shema and let it go. One thing I wanted to mention, it seems to me that many of us cling to anger, not because we have to, but because it gives us something. It gives us a kind of clear moral high ground. It allows us to see ourselves as right and the other as wrong. And sometimes when you feel like you haven't got much, all you have in a situation is the fact that you were in the right. And often psychologically, we will hold on to anger and refuse to forgive because there is something that feels vaguely like moral superiority. And it can feel good, especially when we don't feel empowered ourselves. So there's a word in Greek called sugnome, a famous word, and sometimes it's translated as forgiveness, but what it really means is exculpation or absolution. It's not that I forgive you, but I understand why you did it. And my dignity's now been restored. This is not what I'm talking about. And you should know that Frans de Waal, who was one of the world's famous primatologists, who was like primatologists, gorillas and bonobos and stuff, said that even the great apes have peacekeeping regimens in order to keep, harmony within the group. But there's a very, very famous quote. I want to read it to you now so that I don't mess it up. And this is, according to all sociologists, the birthplace of the written example of forgiveness. And it's in Bereshit, and I think you'll be familiar with it. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. This is the paradigm for forgiveness. What Joseph was able to do was to know with absolute emunah that whatever happened to him happened for him. We sometimes, in our human desire to feel no pain, no distress, no woundedness, are galled when someone hurts us. We can't believe it. We think, how could they? And yet, we too ourselves can cause pain that we don't even know we caused. If we really believed that the Almighty is running the world, if we really looked at the slights and disappointments that are leveled at us and mined that rich seam of discomfort for where we might grow, and believed that it also came to us from the Almighty, holding a grudge and staying angry would no longer be an option. It simply wouldn't be. My sister used to work with dogs that had been abused. She ran this place that dealt with animals that had been abused. And she said that there was a particular dog in this shelter who, if it saw a stick, it would cower in the corner. It would pull back and cower. And what she saw really clearly was that the dog did not obviously have the seichel to understand that the stick was not what to be afraid of, that the stick helped to be held by the master who beat the dog with that stick. When someone hurts us, insults us, causes us grief, we get angry at the person, we refuse to forgive, but we forget that they are only the stick. They are just the stick. We will never, ever fully understand, because we have to live in Emunah. We don't live in Emet. We know that if Almighty had a name and signed with a pen, that signature, that signet would be Emet, truth. But we're not able to have that. So let me just reiterate. It is incumbent upon us, according to the Talmud, to get to the level where if we are not able or interested or healed enough to reinstore a relationship to the way it used to be, or even into a friendly, cooler one, we must get to the place where we can wish good, not harm, for that person. That it is meritorious to every night before you go to bed to recognize that we can clear, even though halachically we are not obligated to forgive a person who did not ask for forgiveness. We should bear in mind that we have caused pain that we may not even know we caused. And as such, mida keneged mida, when we offer forgiveness, we too will be judged by the heavenly court for the things that we didn't know that we caused. But the key is to understand that you'll never understand everything there is to understand. And that's when you understand. And that often we are capable of leaping far beyond the stone fence we hold ourselves behind because we don't know where it's going to end up. Maybe if I forgive that person, they're going to do it again. Am I going to set myself up for the same disappointment? Am I going to set myself up for the same pain? I don't know where this is going to end. So I'll stay here crouched behind this wall. We are more than impalas. We are capable of leaping. That's what Emunah is. And we need to remember that in this fractured world of canceled people, governments, situations, that when we can share our prize seed with our neighbors' fields, when we can be extraordinarily generous with our hearts, when we can trust that it was God who sent us to this situation, not anyone else, then I believe we can begin to undo some of the shattered world that we're living in. And please, God, see the redemption speedily in our times. So that's really what I wanted to share with you this evening.